Hey, yo, welcome back, IB International Economics students, to this video lecture. Today, I want to take this time to really go over illustrating international trade using the classical demand and supply model to illustrate the concept of international trade. So I want to use two examples. I want to use the example of America and Canada. So right here on the left, we can see the two diagrams. These are two diagrams before the countries trade. Okay, before the countries trade, we have the PUS, the price of the United States, and QUS, and PCA and QCM. Okay, so right here we can see absolute and comparative advantages. Now, I have made videos on absolute and comparative advantages. So right here, okay, seeing as how the quantity supplied is greater at lower price levels than the same price levels at Canada, therefore America has an absolute and comparative advantage in the production of apples, and therefore in the most economical sense, America should be producing apples and exporting it to Canada based on the theory of comparative advantage and absolute advantage. Okay, so this is what the diagrams will look like in two isolated economies where trade is non-existent. Okay, however, what does it look like when trade occurs? So let's look at this example. Let's look at this example that I'm highlighted right here. Okay, so this is the American apple market with trade. Okay. So without looking at the DW curve, the world demand curve, let's look at this original curve. We have the DUS, the United States domestic demand. Okay. We also have the SUS, the supply in the United States. So we can see the QUS. QUS is a free market equilibrium without the interference of international trade. QS right here, okay, and then when we introduce international trade into it, we will have DW, okay? We will have the world demand. Now, why is it world demand and not world supply? Okay, it was world demand because America produces apples because it has an absolute advantage. Therefore, America exports apples to the world. Okay, so the world demands American apples. And the world demand is seen as a horizontal line. Now, why is the world demand a horizontal blue line? Why is it horizontal? It is horizontal because it is perfectly elastic. Okay, remember theory of the firm. When we talked about theory of the firm, we talked about perfect competition, right? Perfect competition is the idea that there are infinite sellers and infinite buyers. Now, in order to simplify the graph, we use the idea of the theory of the firm where there are infinite buyers and infinite sellers because the world market with international trade is so the volume is so big, and individual demand and individual supply, okay? So individual countries' demand and individual countries' supply of apples do not affect the world demand and world supply of apples because the world supply is so big, therefore it is perfectly elastic. And that is why the world demand for apples is actually a horizontal line. Now, given that, let's see the intersection between the world demand with the supply and demand curve. So that will give us the QS, okay, the quantity supplied, and the QD. Now, in classical economics, without introducing the theory of international trade and the practical applications of international trade, when we have QS greater than QD, what do we get? We get producer surplus. Okay. However, in this case, this is not producer surplus because this gap between QS and QD is used to export to other countries. Okay. So this gap between QS and QD shows the exports. Okay. The quantity of exports that America is given for apples. Now that we have this graph down and we have our original free market equilibrium, we have our quantity of exports, we have our world demand. Let's look at what it looks like if we put in gains of trade. Okay, so what does the economy of America gain from trade? Okay, this green box right here. Okay, this green box right here signifies the trade, gain from trade that America gains. Now, what was the original consumer surplus? The original consumer surplus was this yellow triangle. Okay. This yellow triangle right here. However, with the introduction of additional consumers from the international stage, consumer surplus is reduced, okay, to this level, okay, and the previous state of consumer surplus becomes the gain in trade. So this is where consumer surplus stands right now. Now, if you need any questions concerning what the colors mean, I have written down a handy note right here. So if you have questions with the colors mean, that's what the colors mean. Now, with consumer surplus, of course, we also have producer surplus. Now, because because of international trade, producer surplus is also decreased into this blue box right here. So this blue box is what producer surplus is left now that America has entered international trade. So this is what it looks like, with trade. Of course, increased gains in trade is illustrated with the green, and the consumer surplus has decreased because international consumers sweep into the market and take additional or surplus of apples or surplus of the product. And we could illustrate the quantity that apples have, the quantity of exports by using QS minus QD, that of which is originally would be the surplus of product, the surplus of supply. However, now that international trade is introduced, instead of being a surplus, it is exported to other countries and added to the country's GDP. So, very good. That is what America will look like. And why do I have to use the two examples of America and Canada? It's because America, in this case, is an exporting country, and Canada right here is an importing country. Now, why is America an exporting country, and why is Canada an importing country? Well, that's because America is an exporting country because it has an absolute advantage in the production of apples. Now, because America has an absolute advantage in the production of apples, they export their apples to other countries, and the other countries take the exports, and therefore the surplus of apples in America is no longer existent. Now, for the Canadian market, it's a little bit different. Canadian market has an absolute disadvantage at the production of apples, and the Canadian market has a comparative disadvantage also at the production of apples. So instead of exporting apples, they import apples, for example, from other countries. So instead of having a horizontal world demand curve, it has a horizontal world supply curve. Why? Because the world supply is influencing the Canadian apple market, because the supply of the world is imported into Canada, and therefore Canada looks at the world supply. It's very easy. If a country has absolute or comparative advantage, they look at world demand. If a country has comparative disadvantage and absolute disadvantage, then they look at world supply. Okay, world supply. Very good. So let's look at this. So once again, the roles switch in the case of importing countries. So quantity demand is right here, quantity supplied is right here, because Canada produces really little apples, but has a lot of demand for apples. They have to import this quantity. So this quantity if you minus the quantity of QD minus QS, we get the imported quantities. And the imported quantities, once again, this was the original. Okay, this was the original consumer surplus without the introduction and the utilization of international trade. However, with international trade, consumer surplus is chopped down to just this part, okay? Just this yellow part represents and shows and signifies consumer surplus now that international trade is enacted. Now, once again, this green box right here signifies the increased gain from international trade. So, so that's international trade illustrated and shown through the usage of demand and supply models. So I hope this video is helpful, and I do hope you did gain at least some bit of value from this illustration and from this lecture. I hope to see you guys in the next video, where we will be talking about tariffs and how to illustrate tariffs. Okay, goodbye.